Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And go right now and leave a 5-star rating and review. It's easy. It just takes a second. Go to the show page on the app you're using right now and just hit 5 stars. This will help us reach new listeners. So thank you so much for doing that. Previous guests on the show have included Scott McKnight, AJ Swoboda, and Carrie Lattiser. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Nijay Gupta. Nijay Gupta is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. Previously, he was a professor of New Testament at Portland Seminary, where he also oversaw the master's thesis program and advises doctoral students. He's the author of the book Worship That Makes Sense to Paul and Prepare, Succeed, and Advance. His latest book is Tell Her Story. Nijay also co-hosts the podcast Slow Theology with AJ Swoboda. Nijay and I have a great conversation about how women led and ministered in the Bible and in the early church. He digs into the stories of Deborah, Junia, Mary, Priscilla, Phoebe, and more. He also talks through the context and culture of the time and place of the early church so that we could start to see with new eyes what women were doing and how they were treated. We also talk about the different leadership categories in the early church. And I really loved that the little section where Nijay talks and shares about how growing up as the son of an immigrant and immigrant parents in Ohio has shaped the way he sees Jesus and the gospel. This is a fantastic conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. You're going to get a lot out of it, and it'll probably lead you to dig into more scripture, which is always a wonderful thing. So here is my conversation with Nijay Gupta. Nijay, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Joshua.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in a little bit about the story of women in the early church and leading. But I'd love to hear your story growing up, your story about finding Jesus. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I grew up, I was born and raised in Ohio, north central Ohio, not far from Cleveland. And my parents are immigrants from India. They came in the early 70s. And I grew up in a Hindu household. My parents are still Hindu. And I became a Christian in high school through my brother, one of my older brothers. I immediately just fell in love with the gospel, fell in love with ministry, went on missions trips, served, short-term with Wycliffe Bible translators. I was a part of a really wonderful Grace Brethren Church, which is a very small denomination. And I would say what I kind of received from that church, my first kind of church experience, was a very traditional experience where men were the pastors, men were the elders, and women were not oppressed in any kind of overt way, but they kind of found their place as helpers, as companions, as volunteers, as worship leaders, and things like that. And I just took for granted that, hey, there are these verses in the Bible that talk about men and women in different kinds of roles, and for whatever reason God has, men have these roles and not women. And I didn't put too much thought in it. In college, I went to Miami University of Ohio, and I was involved in Campus Crusade for Christ. And there I saw a lot more involvement of women that seemed equal, but at the end of the day, Crusade had a very, complementarian theology where men, at the end of the day, had to be kind of the top leaders. Women could lead and give voice, and we had lots of great, strong women leaders. But, women mentor women, men mentor men. And even though women taught sometimes, there was that kind of, sense that, at the end of the day, at the end of it all, men have this cut above women because of their reverence for the Bible and the way they interpreted the Bible. And in those days, I was a huge follower and fan of John Piper and Wayne Grudem.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about theology. I didn't know anything about denominations. I didn't know anything about there are Methodists out there, or Lutherans, or Episcopals. I heard these terms. I had no idea what they really meant. I just knew from going to a Christian bookstore that these books by John Piper and Wayne Grudem fly off the shelves.
Yeah.
They are talked about on Christian radio. And hey, these people love Jesus. They love the Bible. They love the Reformation. And so I want to jump on board. So I just I call this package theology. I liked their focus on scripture, focus on, back to the sources, ad fontes, their focus on Greek and Hebrew. So I just took everything in that package, which includes complementarian theology.
Yeah.
And I kind of took it for granted. And then when I went to seminary at Gordon Conwell, there were professors in different sides of the issue. And I tried to stay to one side with Piper and Grudem, right? But as I got my kind of horizons broadened with interacting with professors that were egalitarian students, my future wife, who was a seminary student, similar background to me, went to, a state school, loves missions, loves evangelism, went to seminary to discern her calling. And I started to realize, gosh, I really need to investigate and discuss this issue so I can really understand how to fit these people I'm meeting into kind of what I'm studying. And so after a year and a half of intensive study in seminary, I realized that I had used certain lines of thought to justify complementarian theology, like male kings, male priests, Jesus is a man, the disciples are men, the apostles are men, Adam was born first, I had made it really neat and simple. But to do that, you have to ignore a lot of other things in the Bible, like Deborah, and like the women in Romans 16, and the women in Philippians 4. And through seminary, through Greek, Hebrew, contextual study, I learned, actually, once you dig more into the context of the ancient world, things start to stand out to you in a way they won't stand out to you just reading the Bible today without that contextual knowledge. Like someone told me, what's the big deal? Phoebe's a letter carrier. Am I supposed to revere my postal worker? It's not the same thing. You're comparing apples and oranges. You have to compare apples and apples. Or when people say women can't be pastors. Well, the first century really didn't have pastors in terms of an office or title. So we have to talk about what they did have. So as I started getting into that, it got messy to the point where I realized, gosh, some of the neat and simple lines that I hear used sometimes in complementarian discussions don't fit all of the important material into the discussion.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to go back into the culture and context of where the Bible was written, these letters were written, what was happening during that time. And so I'd love for you to give us some of that context. What was it like in Roman times at that time? What were women doing? What was the status of women? How were they perceived?
Right. I mean, the first thing we have to say about the ancient Roman world, the world in which Christianity came into being through Jesus, is a patriarchal world. So we have to start there. What is patriarchy? It's kind of a cultural, political, social dynamic where power is officially put into the hands of men.
Yeah. Right.
Patriarchy refers to rule or power of the father, right? The father of the household. And that's the way it was in the vast majority of ancient cultures. You have the Amazonian women, which is a little bit outside the box, but the vast majority of ancient people followed this because men were stronger, men physically. A nation had to live and die by war, and so men were trained to go and fight in war, and women, biologically give birth, and so there was these dividing lines in culture there. The Roman world followed those basic dividing lines and said, hey, we're gonna, but Rome was obsessed with power and expansion. Mm-hmm. And so in order to do that, they created different opportunities that would help Rome to succeed. So one of those is patriarchy, which brings stability and all kinds of other things. Another one is social class. And usually social class had to do with what family you're in, but it also had to do with wealth. And so, for example, the Roman senators were drawn from these high social classes. The Roman emperors were drawn from these high social classes. And women could exercise great power through social class, usually not in an official way. Women couldn't be politicians. They couldn't vote.
Yeah.
But often in what we call social capital. They could accrue a lot of social capital and use that. And the third kind of index of power, so you have patriarchy, you have social class, you also have productivity or success. If someone was just really good at what they do, right, then, like, for example, a businesswoman, right, even if she's middle class, we didn't really have middle class, but what we think of as middle class, even if they're middle class, Rome would kind of step back and say, okay, we're going to let this person continue to do this because as they succeed, Rome succeeds. And so when we start to see that, we see, even though kind of a 30,000-foot view sees men dominate in the public sphere, if you zoom in, you can actually see women exercising power in politics, like the woman Fulvia, in local leadership, like Plancia Magna in Perga, who was actually named demiurgos, which magistrate would be the best term for that. She was the top and perpetual magistrate of this Roman city, which is kind of crazy. No one would actually pick that out of a hat in terms of women's roles in the ancient world. You have the wife of the emperor, Livia, the wife of the emperor Augustus, who exercised vast, think of it like a Michelle Obama, right? Where she's kind of co-president in some ways because of her notoriety, her wisdom, people clamor, we want Michelle to be president, right? Because she just is one of those people that is a star, and Livia was like that. And so then the question is, Joshua, what did early Christianity do with someone like Lydia, who's a successful business person, an independent woman, a woman that leads her own household? Did the apostles say, hey, you could be Christian, we're so happy, but you need to get married, domesticate yourself? We don't get any impression that sort of thing happened. In fact, early Christianity had a lot of successful, what we think of single women like Euodia, Syntyche, Phoebe, Lydia, and many more. And so the early Christians, in my book, I refer to Paul as a kind of blind leader in the sense that he just chose the best person for the job. If you look at Romans 6, and the people he commends, and the people he works with, the people he sends, like Phoebe, right? He has a blind approach to leadership where he says, we're gonna go with the best person for the job.
Yeah, Romans 16, I think, is really important that we don't gloss over that we actually look at the names that Paul wrote. It's one of the teachings that we do here at All Nations, the missions organization that I lead with my wife. We just teach on Romans 16 as this is what ministry, this is what missions looks like, of there's space and room for everybody. And what were they doing? Who were the people that Paul was mentioning? And because we often say, hey, this is a boring list of names, I'm just going to skip over this chapter. I'm going to go to the next book of the Bible. So what is it about Romans 16? What did you found? What did you pull out of that, especially in regards to the women that Paul named in that chapter?
Great question. It's important to understand what Romans 16 actually is, because we often treat it as like the end credits of a movie. Just like these are random names, and we until Marvel movies we tended to leave before the end credits, and now we have to sit through them and scroll on our phones until they're over. But imagine 1,000 years from now, if someone was trying to understand what the Oscars are, right? And then someone else researching it on, whatever Wikipedia is 1,000 years from now, they say, oh, it's just a list of names being read and metal objects being passed out.
Yeah.
Right? That's technically what you're doing, but that doesn't actually reflect the importance of the occasion, right? So to say this is a greetings list is like saying names are being read and metal objects are being passed out. You actually have to understand the cultural dynamics of what Paul is doing. So I refer to it as an honor roll, right? It's, if we're using historical language, it's a list of commendations, much like the Oscars are kind of a list of commendations. And so what Paul is doing, and this is something I got from a scholar named Andrew Clark, he thinks that Paul is showcasing Galatians 3:28 using names where he says neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave or free. He's intentionally going out of his way to name men and women, Jews and Gentiles, slave and free, high class and low class, to show the diversity of the churches in Rome and how people from all different walks of life can be commended for their courageous, faithful ministry work. And when we read Romans 16, we don't get how diverse this list is because we don't know these names. But about a third of the names are names of women. And as I was researching for my book, Tell Her Story, one thing I realized is it is not only unusual, but maybe even unprecedented to have so many women named positively in a row in any list from the Roman world, on any document. I mean, I've tried to find comparable things, and maybe there are things with 2 or 3 women's names, but to have 7, 8, 9, 10,
wow,
it may be the only thing of its kind in the Roman world that is trying to commend a group of people. So what does that tell us? It tells us Paul is applying the whole of theology of Romans, what he's trying to argue, to these people and saying, look at these people's lives, and they're actually reflecting all the things I'm teaching in the book of Romans. And the fact that he's going to do that with women and say, Mary worked hard, right? Priscilla and Aquila risked their necks. All Gentiles owe them a debt. Junia and Andronicus were prominent among the apostles. The apostles are the best of the best, right? They're the like Marines, they were top of their class in the Marines, So what Paul's doing there is really significant because it's not just a list of names. It's not just a list of greetings. These are the people that you would make early Christian action figures of. And so these people are really important. And if we treated it that way, that would change how we look at women.
In Romans 16 talks about Junia. You point out that, she was following Jesus before Paul. It may have even been a mentor to Paul. He looked up to her, and it may have even been among the 70 or 72 that were sent out by Jesus, disciples. I think one of the things that you point out that, as you read Luke 10, oftentimes people have like, hey, 2 men are going out 2 by 2, right? But it could be a couple. And, for just my experience working in the Middle East, so I was in Jordan, so I was across the valley, across the Jordan River, but I was in a pretty similar culture to back in the day, that when my wife and I went out, we were able to meet with a whole household. If I went out with another man, only men were allowed in the room.
Right.
We couldn't actually meet with the family. If my wife went out with another woman, only the women were allowed in the room. And there was a different dynamic and a more, more effective dynamic to reach the household. More complete when my wife and I went out together. It was night and day. And so we always wanted to go out, man and woman, and we didn't want to go out with single gender. Could you, as you were researching some of this stuff and you're trying to find those things out, what was the importance of women ministering and leading in that day to be able to have effective work in that culture?
Right. I think you're spot on with this idea that, men weren't going to naturally minister to women in a private setting. So it would make sense that you had women to do that. But what's interesting is you have, for example, Mary and Martha in Luke invite Jesus over to their house.
Yeah.
And again, one of the cultural things regarding hospitality is, if you invite somebody, you're acting as host, and Martha's the one inviting Jesus over.
Yeah.
She's playing host. There's certain ways that we know that's true. And there's no men in the scene. There may have been men there, but Luke doesn't mention any. And so, in my mind in the past, I've always imagined kind of bustling house with men and women. The fact that she's extending the invitation means that she may be the actual head of the house. I know there's a little bit of speculation there. But then you also have Junia, and we could talk a little bit more about Junia. One of the things that's mentioned about her is she was a prisoner for the sake of Christ, just like Paul was. He mentions that in Romans 16. And I did a lot of research on this, ended up writing 2 articles on it, one before the book came out, one after. And this, what I was surprised by is that we have very little record from the Roman world of women going to prison because for petty crimes like stealing a loaf of bread, you would be fined or beaten or sent home to be punished by your family if you were a woman. So prison was really for serious crimes like murder or treason, or in Paul's case, inciting a riot, public disturbance, things that would be a threat to the Roman order. Then the question is, what's Junia doing in prison? Because it's extremely rare. Another thing that I found in my research is women did not have their own prisons. So, and you didn't have your own prison cells. You were just thrown into a big room and you'd be chained. But we know from non-Christian, non-biblical resources that women were victimized in prison by guards especially. I thought it'd be by other inmates, but they're chained up. But by guards, they would be tortured and assaulted and all kinds of other things. And we actually learn about that from a story from the early church called The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, about 2 Christian women who go to prison and are worried about being assaulted. So women, one of the points in my book, Joshua, is women, we sit around and say, where can women be and what can they do?
Yeah.
And when we read the Bible, when we read the New Testament, they're always in the wrong places and our assumptions, right? Women like Junia, women like Lydia. And that's kind of the point of my book, is to shake people out of what I call a snow globe imagination of the ancient world. Yeah. We have to actually see where people are and what they're doing. And when we see them for who they are and what they're actually doing, they're doing some amazing things.
That's pretty remarkable, and I think it's careful reading of the text. It's not glossing over things through a lot of times our Western lenses and our lenses of today, and we assume that the way that today works in our culture was the same as the culture of the Bible, and so we just have to do some careful work. And I thank you for your scholarship to be able to do that and pull that out and help people see. Just like as you introed the book talking about the movie Hidden Figures, we needed some people to say, no, there were African-American women in math experts and engineers that were doing work at NASA that were very significant and played a significant part, but we just haven't told their story yet. And so we need to have people like you to be able to bring out the story that's already there. And it's not just something where you're saying, hey, I'm just going to try and pull this out of the hat, but it's there. If we have eyes to see and ears to hear what is happening. So that's a lot of times I think people, I don't know, like me, I often think that, okay, Jesus is the one who brought this egalitarian empowerment of women. He has women disciples. You can see that happening. He's talking to Mary, that she's sitting at his feet with Mary and Martha, and that she is choosing the right way. I know that Kenneth Bailey says that would assume that she would be like a disciple of learning from Jesus as the rabbi. But I assume that Jesus brought this, but really it was happening with the Israelites beforehand, happening with Deborah. You start your book out with Deborah. Why is Deborah important? What can we learn from her? And how can we really start to view the Old Testament in a different light too?
Yeah, I've got a lot of positive feedback about starting with Deborah because a lot of Christians just don't know who she is and how important of a figure she is, and how if we raise any questions, I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I've heard so many people say, women just aren't good at, and then they just list things, preaching, or they're ditzy, or, they're too emotional, or they're focused on relationships and not executive decisions, or, and on and on and on. And if I have 25 seconds on an elevator and someone asks me, hey, how can you say women should be pastors? Aren't women gullible or blah, blah, blah? I would start with Deborah because I can immediately get to answering those questions using a case study that is right there in the Bible. I don't have to talk about letter carriers. I don't have to talk about discipleship and rabbinic practices. I can just get right into it. So here's the interesting about Deborah is, the book of Judges narrates one of the darkest periods in Israel's history where they were told to enter the land, drive out the Canaanites, and just flourish. And they didn't. I mean, they're given all these warnings in Deuteronomy. You got to drive out the Canaanites. You got to put them to death. You can't worship their gods. You can't intermarry. And they don't. And so now they're in the land and they're reaping the consequences of being harassed by the Canaanites. And so, Moses is gone, Joshua is gone, and the kingdom has not been established yet. So you have this vacuum of leadership. And so what God does is he raises up these temporary military leaders like Gideon and Samson, and he basically has them, their main job is to fight off the Canaanites and establish peace in the land. And this is all because God has allowed these enemies to overwhelm them because of Israel's sin. So these judges like Samson, Gideon, they aren't great spiritual leaders. They don't have a great education. They weren't appointed by Joshua or anybody else. They're basically just raised up to fight off the enemy.
Yeah.
Deborah is officially one of the judges, but she's unlike the other judges because she actually wears multiple hats. Not only is she involved in the military, Barak is the official general, but she's involved. But she's also an actual judge. The word judge means, like what we think, someone who judges, cases. None of the other judges actually seem to do that, but she does. So she's a judicial leader. The Song of Deborah says that she's mother in Israel, which means she's the executive leader. Because she's judging disputes that she's going to use Torah, the law, to settle, means she's the spiritual leader. She's also a prophet, which means that she's a spokesperson for God. So to my mind, it makes no sense to say, women can be a deacon or they can teach children, but no, we cannot let them be a part of the elder board because God has just not seen it fit to give them senior executive leadership. I'll say, why would he take that risk with Deborah?
Yeah.
In the darkest period, it would be one thing if it was a lame duck period. It's like, you just have a couple weeks and just, shuffle some papers, sit at the Oval, sit at the, Resolute desk, don't do a lot. But this is this is almost like a Job moment where Satan's like, what are you going to do in this situation?
Yeah.
To say, we're going to put Deborah in the game, and in the darkest period.
Yeah.
And guess what? She succeeds. She's the only one that a song is sung of, which is the Old Testament's way of saying, well done, Deborah, good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
So when people say, it's only because a man wasn't, well, guess what? Barak would have been the natural choice because God's looking for military leaders.
Yeah.
The fact he chose Deborah means that she's extra special, not she's second choice. Barak would have been first choice. And then, there were no righteous men. Well, guess what? Neither Samson nor Gideon were righteous men. That's pretty clear if you just read through it.
Yeah.
So he had pretty low standards. If he wanted to choose a man, he could have chosen pretty much anybody. He could just pick someone out of a hat. But Deborah comes off as the most virtuous judge of them all that's given anything more than a couple verses.
Yeah, and I think that story is really, really impactful and helpful for us to say, oh, this woman is full of wisdom and maturity, and she's being raised up by God, being able to lead. And because of her, things work out. She's very important for us to realize what God is doing there, and then what God allows, Mary, the mother of Jesus, to do, essentially raising him after Joseph has passed away. She is the one that is providing the care and, the growth for God, our Savior, Jesus. And he's saying, hey, you could put this, you could have this authority in his life. And, you point out, too, that she was probably right there in the day of Pentecost, there with the apostles, and she was a central figure, an important one that was there. Can you speak to the importance of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the early church, even after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus?
Yeah, let me go back a little bit to earlier in Mary's life, because obviously she's a part of the Christmas story. That's kind of what I knew, as a young believer. But she pops up throughout his ministry. She's there when he says, all of my disciples are my mother and father. I don't think that's rejection of her. That's actually saying, you're also going to be, I'm focusing on my disciples. You're welcome to be a part of that too. It's kind of what he's saying to her. And then, she's there in some other scenes, wedding at Cana and things like that. But what's interesting is it would be normal, I think, in that kind of scenario for a traveling teacher to not have his mother with him, right? She would be at home with other children or with her relatives or whoever. She might visit, but she's not going to be just around all the time. He's traveling a lot. So there's no assumption that she's going to be with him throughout this whole time. And then she's there at the cross, which is interesting. Not surprising because her son's dying. Yeah. But then she's there at the tomb. Also not surprising because it's her son and he's dead, and it's part of her responsibility to, anoint him, his body, and et cetera. She's worried. But then she's there when the angels give the instructions, which could be a coincidence that she's still there, because Mary Magdalene is the focus of some of those texts. But then, and I just noticed this the other day, she's actually there when that group of women travel back to the male disciples and tell them. And there actually wouldn't be a reason for her to be there if all she was the mother of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. You could make an argument she's just, quote unquote, just the mother of Jesus at the tomb, at the cross, but to be there when they actually tell them, that's interesting. And then you mentioned Acts 1:14, where it says she's at Pentecost. This was interesting, and I got this from a scholar named Mike Parsons and his wife Heidi Hornick, I think is her last name. They have looked at pieces of art based on Pentecost and studied kind of how artists throughout history, especially in the medieval period and the Baroque period, have painted Pentecost. And there's kind of a Catholic tradition of putting Mary at the center of Pentecost, and then 6 disciples on her left and 6 disciples on her right with the flaming tongues, and then the dove over her head. Why? Number one, they're recognizing that she's mentioned in the text.
Yeah.
Number two, Jesus has ascended pretty recently in Acts chapter 1, so she's kind of the family rep of Jesus' presence. And 3, it's a parallel to Luke chapter 1, where the angel says the Spirit will overshadow you, which is the conception of Jesus. And then here now, the anointing of the church, she's there as well as kind of a continuity of birth of Christ to birth of the church. So she holds this really key role as kind of a line of continuity in Jesus' absence. Now, the weird thing is she's not talked about by Paul. She's not talked about by James or Peter. She's not talked about the rest of Acts. So we don't know what happened to her. But she stands right there as an important part of the early Christian community in the beginning of the book of Acts. And I've always just thought about, I don't know if you've watched The Chosen. I like the show.
Yeah.
Some people don't, but I actually like the show. You have to suspend, you have to just say this is not word for word. And I'm okay with that. Anyway, what kind of struck me as I'm watching the show, because Mary, Mother of Jesus, is in the show, is as Jesus is traveling around, she's there and she's old. And I think of Mary as like a 16-year-old.
Yep.
Right? But the reality is she gets older just like the rest of us. And this idea, and that really, I had to change how I imagine Mary. Instead of imagining Mary as a 14 or 16 or 18-year-old, imagining her as someone my age.
Yeah.
And saying, she's going to be somebody the church leans on as a confidant, as, someone who taught Jesus, and not only learned from Jesus, but taught Jesus. Yeah. So I think Protestants have gone too far in that to just kind of lock her and chain her up into the Christmas story.
You mentioned earlier that there weren't really pastors in the early church. What were the ministry roles? What were the roles of the church? And what examples of women do we have in those roles?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I will first say something about pastors. I give a lecture sometimes on Ephesians 4:11, where Paul mentions the different kind of leadership categories.
Yeah.
And so he says apostles and prophets, and then he also mentions poimen, which are, we would sometimes translate as pastors. It means shepherds.
Yeah.
And then he mentions a couple of other groups. And people want to say, okay, look, these are pastors. I would actually just translate that shepherds, because Paul doesn't actually use that word as a ministry office term in 1 Corinthians, where it would have been natural, or Romans, or Philippians, where he does end up using leadership terms. What I think is happening is Paul believed that leaders shepherd, but it didn't actually serve as a leadership title. So let's set that aside. So I think three terms are regularly used by Paul, and he's our best evidence because we have so much literature from him in the New Testament. So one term is diakonos, which we translate as deacon or minister. I prefer minister, but we translate as deacon, minister. I came up with my own term, ministry provider, because technically diakonos means servant, but we have to see how Christians respected these people as leaders, just like we respect our doctors as medical providers. Yes, they're servants of the people, but they have training, expertise, and status, meaning, we treat them with respect. So, did women serve that capacity? Absolutely. Phoebe is an example, is named as a diakonos, and it's helpful to know in Greek, it's the generic term diakonos is used for her, not a feminized term. She's not a deaconess. Yeah. She's just a minister or a deacon or ministry provider. And what did these people do? I think they actually just did the work of ministry. It could be high level. It could be quote unquote menial. I think they just deployed the ministries of the church. Whatever needed to be done to help equip the saints and build up the church, they were doing the work. And Phoebe is one of those people. Paul actually refers to himself as diakonos. I don't think that he meant that in any sort of technical sense, but he refers to Jesus as a diakonos as well. A second term is episkopos, which is sometimes translated bishop. I think that's not the correct translation for it, because that makes me think of pointy hats. And nobody had pointy hats back then, as far as I know. And overseer or supervisor, both of those words are good literal translations of episkopos. And it's a verb that refers to administration, oversight. So anybody in a kind of leadership administrative role, like an executive pastor kind of role, that doesn't mean they're not doing hands-on stuff, but the kind of their main hat is going to be, what we think of as leadership cultivation.
Yeah.
That's going to be what these people are. They are kind of responsible for just keeping the ship running smoothly. Did women serve in those roles? Nobody is named as an episkopos, male or female. We know there were episkopoi. We know there were overseers, but nobody's actually named as such. But I do think women were, because Paul tended to rely on household leaders as these overseers. So people like Philemon, Stephanus, Achaeus, Gaius, right? He names all these people. I think we could add to that Nympha. I think we could add to that Lydia. So I think there are certain people in the New Testament that would fit that. Is that speculation? It's as much speculation as saying a certain man is an overseer, because we have to guess who fits into these roles. When Paul says Stephanus and his household, he's referring to a leader of a household. I think episkopos fits that. I think Nympha fits that as well, who's a woman. So the third term is presbyteros, which literally means old person. And the diakonos and episkopos are both verbal nouns, meaning they reflect actions, right? Serving and overseeing. Presbyteros doesn't reflect an action. It reflects a status of being old. But it doesn't mean like once you turn 80 that you're all of a sudden now a leader in the church. Yeah. It means they're equating old age with wisdom and maturity. So, the example I like to use is I travel a lot for work. So I have the privilege of being a Ruby One World elite status Alaska Airlines member. And I don't wear a badge or anything. I would wear one if they gave one. But that means that based on how much I fly, how many air miles I've accumulated, I have a special status.
Yeah.
Right? It's not something I do. It's not, but it means I'm recognized for having achieved a certain status based on number of miles flown, which doesn't actually mean a whole lot. But with elders, what it means is they kind of get this invisible status for being older, wiser, more mature, right? Just like we talk to our grandparents and we say, tell me about your generation, or how'd you get through this, or how'd you get through that, or great grandparents, and what was the Great Depression like? So churches relied, just as Israel did, on wise older people to give wisdom towards the leadership of the church. Think about an old tribal community. The elders usually aren't just named as like you 10 people are elders. Like, let's say someone, let's say a child falls into a river, right? You say, help, right? Someone nearby says, help. Who's going to come running? It's the old people that can run. The old people in the community who care about the community, right? The people that are given trust over community. And so nobody's actually named an elder by name. It's not like Elder Marcus, Elder Frank, Elder Junia. They're not named as such in the New Testament. So we actually don't know any elders by name. But I take it for granted that you could fit into any position like diakonos or episkopos and be an elder if you've reached that status. Now, Paul does say appoint elders. I think that's because in metropolitan cities and things like that, it can be kind of chaos. You want to make sure you have a clear group of people who are overseeing, right? The leadership. I don't see them doing a specific number of actions, even though they will, as much as they're given trust over the community. Right? So I actually think that overseers who were mature, I'm assuming most of them were elders. I'm thinking diakonoi, ministry providers, who were mature, meaning not in training, were elders. Did women fit into that? I think they had to have, because how could someone like Junia be an apostle, be older than Paul in the faith, and not qualify as an elder? So here's my argument. If Paul qualifies as an elder, and he actually does refer to himself as an old person in Philemon, if Paul qualifies as an elder, I don't see how Junia could not qualify as an elder if the litmus test was maturity through experience.
Yeah.
Right? The way that we would respect like older people in the faith. Like my hero in my mind is always John Stott. Like I always think of John Stott. Like he's that guy for me, right? Or Eugene Peterson.
Yep.
Right? Or Marva Dawn. And I just think like, okay, I mean, our culture should attribute to those people elder status because they're proven older, I mean, passed away, but older, wise, mature people. Like, how could they not? So how could it not be true of Junia? That would be that's my argument in a nutshell.
It's a good one. And there's some more ministry activity and things and women, and I'd really encourage everybody to go and read your book, Tell Her Story. It's great scholarship. It's fantastic, and it's accessible to a lot of people. It's something where, for us as a missions organization, in our statement of faith, we say we believe in men and women in leadership, and people. That's one of the things that people ask all the time. How can you believe in women leaders and pastors? And so one of the things I'm going to do is I'm just going to give them your book and say, here you go, which is great to have that source and that scholarship so that we can start to look at it. So thank you. There's a few questions that I want to ask you a little bit of how does your life as a son of an immigrant and Hindus coming into the United States in Ohio, how does that affect the way that you read Scripture, you interact with the church and Christian community?
Yeah, good question. I grew up in a very white rural town, and so it was I just stuck out, in the school, and I stuck out as I'm walking around. People have trouble pronouncing my name, and things like they just don't run into a lot of Nijays in my little hometown. It was a wonderful place, and nobody was like using racial slurs against me, but I definitely felt like a misfit, and I felt like I'm an interloper, or I don't belong in this place. And one of the ways I read Scripture is just attentive to how someone like Jesus just notices people who are outside, who are on the margins. The Syrophoenician woman, or the woman with the flow of blood, or the man who could not get into the pool. He just kind of notices people, or the apostles when they see, someone down on their luck, and they say, I don't have silver and gold, but I do have, I give you, pick up your bed and walk. Yeah. Like I that really resonated with me as, kind of an alien in my environment, to know that the gospel welcomes and sees, the somebodies and the nobodies, the insiders and the outsiders. And Jesus himself, dying where he did, made a statement to identify with the outsider. By being cursed, by being on a cross, made himself someone who can identify with the cursed. And the cursed in these cases often mean the people that don't fit into people's boxes. Yeah. Right. And so that's given me attunement and eyes to see some of that. One of the things I love, and Scott McKnight, I'm going to toot his horn a little bit, is he's coming out with a Bible translation of the New Testament called the Second Testament. And one thing he does is he brings back the Jewish names in the Bible that have been anglicized. And so Miriam or something like that for Mary, that sort of thing. I love that because it makes it more natural for me not to have an anglicized name. Yeah. And some of those little things just kind of stick with me. Like, okay, like when I growing up, I really struggled with being different. I was unhappy. My parents gave me a foreign name because people had trouble pronouncing it. People would make fun of it. I got all kinds of nicknames. And, my oldest daughter has an Indian name, and I love it now. And it's a mark of distinction and pride and cultural pride, but also it's okay to be different. So I can just point to biblical texts and say there's all kinds of interesting names in there. We need to love them all.
I love that. That's a great perspective, and great that Jesus is the one that says, "Hey, I see you. You are worth it, and you're worthy, and I'm here for you as well." And I just love that about Jesus. Isn't that? I mean, he's amazing. Jesus is amazing. A couple of questions at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Don't play so much video games. No, what would I give seriously to my 21-year-old self?
Oh, you don't believe that. You love playing those video games, I'm sure.
I do. I played too many video games back then. What would I say to my 21-year-old self? I would say take care of yourself, take care of your body, take care of your health. I was so driven by studies and academic success and other things related to success. I just didn't take good care of myself. I didn't set myself up for success physically. Also, I just did not believe that it mattered to take care of your emotions, process your emotions. So I might say, sign yourself up for therapy. I meet with a spiritual director, which isn't the same thing as therapy, but it accomplishes the ends of getting me to process my emotions and process my life. I would say, whether you need to or not, at 21, start now. Get healthy. Slow down and enjoy life.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's good. Anything you've been reading, watching lately you could recommend, or playing as a video game you could recommend?
Let's stick to books, Josh.
All right.
Let's stick to books. I'm gonna just mention one here. I just pulled off the shelf. This is a good friend of mine, Amy Peeler. A book I read back in the summer last year, Women and the Gender of God. She really raises the question: is there, God created male and female, but is there a male preference in the personhood of God? And her answer is no. But there's been a history of Christianity that has leaned in favor of a male preference. And so this is a fantastic book. I ended up reading it just because I asked her if I could read it ahead of time, and I ended up just loving it. And it's one of the few times I've said to a scholar, "Can I endorse your book?" Usually they ask me. I was like, "Can I endorse your book?" Because I love this book. Absolutely loved it. It's a page turner. She's a great scholar. It's carefully written, but it is provocative in the sense that she'll push some buttons. She'll smash some cherished idols. So that's definitely one. If you've read Tell Her Story, even if you haven't, that would be the next book to read.
Love it. That's good. So how can people connect with you, Nijay, and find your book?
I know that you know AJ Swoboda, who's my partner in podcast crime. So we have a podcast called Slow Theology, formerly known as In Faith and Doubt. We just process messy Christianity, which I think is something that you care about as well. Yep. We just try to be honest. Like, there's this trick we use in our podcast where we basically don't have any answers. And we just talk about hard things, and we're just honest about it, and we try to put just a little lemon twist of hope on it at the end. But I think what we try to do is normalize the mess. Just to say, hey, we don't need everything to be neat and tidy. The Bible's messy, churches are messy, but Jesus is beautiful. And that keeps us going. So we're a few years into this. We started during the pandemic, but we said we'd do it as long as people were, finding it helpful. Thankfully, they do. So that would be, I'd say, the best place to catch up with what I'm up to.
Great. Well, Nijay, thank you so much for your work and your scholarship and you being a voice to say women have led and ministered all the way throughout the people of God and in the time of Jesus and the early church, and they have a role to play today, and they're important as God has created all of us in His image. So thank you for going through that. I loved talking to you, having this conversation. It was a fantastic one. So thank you. And I really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.